Welcome to the Looking Ahead podcast, where we go inside the minds of tech leaders and luminaries to understand the futures they envision, hosted by Ahead CTO Eric Kaplan. Today's guest is Hashicorp CEO Dave McJannet. In this episode, Eric and Dave explore the importance of cloud infrastructure in the world of multicloud, Kubernete's place in the app management landscape, and the evolution of open source. Enjoy the episode.
Great. I'm honored today to welcome Dave McJannet, CEO of Hashicorp. And Dave, I'd like to maybe just start out by thanking you for joining. And maybe you could just give a little bit of background on yourself, where you've been, how long you've been at Hashi, and we'll go from there.
Great. Yeah, I really appreciate the opportunity to talk shop a little bit. I've been at Hashicorp for about 4 years. In fact, slightly after, a bit more than 4 years. But I've been broadly in this infrastructure market for a bit longer. The thing that I really find most interesting are infrastructure companies, and I think sort of the enabling role that infrastructure plays has always been of interest to me. I spent time at Microsoft working on the server business, but I also spent time at a company called SpringSource, which became Pivotal. Did a company called Hortonworks in the Hadoop market, and then I also spent time at GitHub. So I've been in the infrastructure market and the open source market for quite a while. It's one of those things that has always appealed to me.
So I want to circle back on that open source background in a little bit, but maybe you can start out and kind of, Hashicorp, some stellar products out there. Terraform started out in Vagrant, Packer, Console, Vault. Really just a huge groundswell of momentum in the community around infrastructure, helping to build multi-cloud environments. A big play with HashiCorp is this cloud operating model that you talk about. Maybe just give us a little bit of the vision, where you are today and where you want to take the company.
So we tend to think of the world in terms of market transitions, and what appealed to me a few years ago. I actually got involved with Armon and Mitchell about 1.5 years before I joined them directly. Is through this lens of transitions, and what was clear is the world was going from one way of running infrastructure to another way of running infrastructure. On-prem predominantly, very static world that we've all understood. It's complicated to run on-prem infrastructure, but it's relatively well understood. We have networks and IP addresses and firewalls and all the rest. And our view was that the next platform is not just cloud, it's multi-cloud. It's basically, this world is inside the data center, this world is outside the data center. And obviously those things need to connect to each other, but the fundamental platform transition is one of multi-cloud. The world is not going to build all its net new applications on Amazon. There will be Amazon and Azure and Google and Alibaba and others. So that was the core mission of the company, is to say, let's contemplate how the world changes for all the participants in IT as they have to run cloud infrastructure across more than one cloud platform, as opposed to just running on-prem. You decompose that into the problem domain. Well, there are ops people, security people, networking people, and developers in IT. Let's try and address the challenges of running that operating model in a multi-cloud sense. And that's how the products line up. For the ops person, Terraform is the product that they predominantly use. It's, in the old world, the model was I used to provision a virtual machine when someone needed something. Well, now I give an instruction set to a platform, Azure or Amazon or even vSphere. So the operating model for ops people is just very different. So that's more how we engage, just to say, okay, Terraform is used by ops people to address the challenges of running cloud. Vault is the reorientation of the world towards identity as the basis of security, rather than IP address as the basis of security. And that addresses the challenge of running applications in cloud. And actually the Twitter thing caught my attention yesterday, and I'll come back to that in a second. And then the third thing is what happens in the world of networking as you go from on-prem to sort of outside the data center. And a service name becomes much more important than IP address. Can container talk to database? Well, let's create that routing rule, but it's done in terms of service name. So I think the world of ops, security, networking, and development basically get recast in the cloud world, and we can align our product set against those four personas.
Great. What's the ecosystem in your mind like in terms of working with all the, as you said, networking companies, virtualization companies, database companies, and being this kind of in the middle of having to create providers or support providers. And is it welcome? Are you welcomed with open arms? Is it something that you guys have better luck with some companies than others? And where do you feel like you guys are looking to plug holes in the provider ecosystem right now?
So the way, to me, I actually spent time in product development years ago in the world of middleware, and there's a lot of similarity. What we aspire to do is provide a consistency of approach across, say, like take provisioning as an example, infrastructure provisioning. We say, okay, well, I want you to be able to have a consistent approach, whether you're provisioning vSphere or whether you're provisioning AWS. How that decomposes is basically an integration problem. It's like, okay, well, Amazon's releasing new services every week, so how do I make sure that those are available in Terraform every week? What you end up doing is you end up creating essentially infrastructure middleware. And then the challenge is an integration challenge. And that's actually why I think these markets have to be addressed in open source, because if you take Terraform, for example, there's Terraform core, which is the core CLI you use to interface to something, to give an instruction set. And then there's a provider for every environment you want to interface to, akin to an adapter in the middleware sense. I would have to employ probably 1,500 people to keep up to date with that market of every time Amazon releases a new service, Azure releases a new service. So we decompose into those two categories. And so we play this unique role for the end user who wants a consistent way to provision infrastructure that's actually really beneficial to the infrastructure providers themselves. Like, all we're trying to do is reduce the friction for someone provisioning Amazon Compute or Azure Compute. So we have a provider for every environment. Those providers all live in open source. When Amazon releases a new service, they update the Terraform provider for Terraform to make sure that their users can use Terraform on that new service. So it actually is this really unique seam of a role that is really advantageous to the cloud providers because it reduces the friction for consumption. And I think that's why this market exists. We play this sort of enabling role between the end user and the infrastructure providers. And it's uniquely good for both parties in that at the end of the day, Amazon's not trying to sell you software for provisioning. They're trying to sell you compute. Right. What they want is they want you to get your applications running on Amazon as fast as possible and using as many of the cloud native services of Amazon as fast as possible so that it'll stay there. And what the end user wants is a consistent way to do that on Amazon, because Amazon's really good at some stuff, and Google, because Google's really good at some stuff, in a consistent way. So, you play this sort of harmonizing role, which is both, super valuable to the end user and the infrastructure provider themselves, but also uniquely only doable in open source, because like if VMware were to try to offer some of their value proposition, they'd have to hire 1,500 more people in the ecosystem.
And this is where the community becomes so important as well.
Yeah, I think Terraform's a great example. I was looking the other day, there are 1,300 or 1,400 contributors to the Terraform project on GitHub.
Yeah, I was just looking at that before we got on here and GitHub. It's amazing.
It's remarkable. And I think as a data point, we think of some things like Apache Spark being really big projects. Well, Apache Spark has about 1,300 contributors in its entire ecosystem. So it just sort of gives you a sense for the scale of it. And I think that's representative of the infrastructure layer. There tends to be standardization at the infrastructure layer. And I think, we've been fortunate that our products have played that role.
Yeah, one of the things, thinking about that cloud operating model, going multi-cloud, is I kind of break the problem down when I talk to customers. There's, people, there's process, and then there's the technology. And, many of us, I think, believe the technology is becoming or has become maybe the least of the problems in terms of multi-cloud adoption. What are your thoughts? What are you seeing? I'm seeing still people as one of the biggest issues in terms of adoption and education and moving faster and becoming more agile in the enterprise, as well as letting go of some of those old processes, in terms of how things are done in the legacy world and moving to more infrastructure as code and blueprints for technology instead of and deployments instead of one-offs being done manually. What are your thoughts? Are you seeing similar?
Yeah, I mean, I think we tend to look through the lens of history and be sort of go, why is it happening this way? The lens of platform transitions are helpful because you go, okay, well, why are people adopting cloud infrastructure, broadly speaking? It's because they're building net new applications on cloud, right? It's the whole digital transformation push we all understand. So, okay, great. All new applications by and large are being built on cloud. Not entirely, but the vast majority, but that's why the cloud providers are growing so fast. That's no different than when we went from sort of mainframe to client server, right? It's no different. We had this platform transition. There was a huge skills gap when you went from this world to the next world. It took a few years for that to catch up because running client server infrastructure is no less complicated than running mainframe. It's just different. And I think that's kind of where we are as an industry, truthfully. I think that the tooling for how to run cloud infrastructure and the problem domain is actually super well understood. How do you do infrastructure operations? It's pretty well understood. How do you do security? Very well understood. Networking? Very well understood. But the population of people that know how to do that is smaller than the demand there is for it. And I think when we went from mainframe to client server, you didn't have this massive pressure on digital transformation happening at the same time. So I think that's a bit of what we're feeling is it's really acute because not only is this an entirely new platform, it dovetails with an enormous business pressure on digital transformation, which just means there's a lack of skill sets for how to do this. It's not unknowable, it's not unknown. We talk about it as a cloud operating model. It's actually really well understood how you use identity as the basis of security, how you use service name as the basis of networking. But the people skills gap is absolutely the challenge. I think, we see the world bifurcate in two. Many of the cloud native companies that you might use, whose products you might use every day, they all run on Hashicorp products today, and the level of sophistication is extraordinary. There was a blog post published a couple of weeks ago from Cloudflare, which caught my attention, where they it wasn't coordinated with us, but they published a blog that showed that Cloudflare runs on Console and Nomad, right? So literally 10%. Yeah, 10% of the world's internet traffic runs through Console. Well, that's interesting, or indirectly. And so the scale is just almost unthinkable of what people in the cloud native community are running. And then you go to a traditional bank, and they just don't have the people inside the company that can do that. I think that's where the industry is, but I don't think it's surprising. I just think it's a function of time. Fast forward another couple of years, and it'll catch up. It's just really acute right now.
Yeah, I like to say, at that bank, they have to sit there and worry about keeping the lights on and turning the crank every day in terms of, all the entrenched technology that's built up over decades and decades. And the cloud native company doesn't have that baggage that they have to worry about, which is a major advantage.
We actually have there's a legitimate challenge that we have, interestingly, is the catalyst for people adopting our products is typically for their cloud transition. So they'll establish a cloud team that says, hey, let's get this business group running new applications on cloud with all the cloud native properties. And that is generally the entry point that we engage with customers commercially. I think we're, 8 of the Fortune 10 and hundreds of the Global 2000 commercially. But then paradoxically, the on-prem teams, the traditional teams, start saying, hey, wait a second, this idea of infrastructure as code is actually pretty helpful to my on-prem fleet. So can I just not use that to provision my vSphere as well? Well, of course you can. And then they go, well, the idea of low trust networks, that's probably a good idea internally. And so this stuff actually kind of works its way internally. So those legacy teams that we've seen, ironically, over the last 3 or 4 years, are huge adopters of our tech. So they are actually trying to adopt a common operating model for their cloud fleet and increasingly their on-prem fleet for things like security and provisioning as well. So it kind of works its way in, interestingly.
Yeah, and I think our experience with Hashicorp Products has been, you see products like Vagrant out there, bits and pieces in the enterprise. You see Terraform being used. But what I've really seen the legacy enterprise take a hold of is Vault. And, that hits both legacy, future cloud native, built applications, as well as, obviously the security team. So, it's kind of a rallying point for a lot of people to get on the same page in terms of how they want to operate and look differently, that touches a lot of different real estate, so to speak, within the enterprise.
Yeah, so I think that's a really good illustration of how the model works too, and why the open source model works so well. It's been fascinating. So, what Vault is fundamentally is an identity broker. So, rather than my application making a request to the database and getting the data back, first I say, no, authenticate your identity before I give you that access. And then you can, whether that's a container running on Amazon or a container running on-prem, it'll use the AWS identity or the Active Directory identity, depending which one it is. So that brokerage of identity, people say like, hey, I want to be able to apply that to Amazon, but wait a second, I have this SAP instance. Can I not? Like, that's a good idea. So every request going to SAP, I actually want to broker through this identity and access management platform for all the machine-to-machine connectivity that gets data in and out of SAP. And so lo and behold, someone says, oh, I've contributed the SAP HANA backend for Vault. Oh, I've contributed the Oracle database backend for Vault. And that's just how the open source model works. So now I can have this common experience, whether I'm having machine-to-machine connectivity on Amazon or machine to SAP connectivity or Oracle. And it kind of enables that bridging of the two worlds. And it's very unique to open source because, we would probably not have built those integrations ourselves because we're focused on the cloud use case. But the fact that someone can build that and contribute to it and make it available to everybody sort of speaks to the enormous kind of standardization role that we help to play across all these disparate technology types to allow you to have a common workflow for how to interface to them. It's been really fun to watch.
Yeah, you guys are becoming the broker between all these systems, whether it's security or infrastructure, which is interesting.
Networking is the one I think I'm most acutely interested in because you can see that happening there too.
Yeah, for sure. Well, maybe transitioning on the networking topic and, talking about Kubernetes a little bit. I'd say our client base is still trying to figure out how do I adopt Kubernetes, what are the use cases, and piloting, certain initiatives based on, cloud-based orchestration services in Amazon and Azure, leveraging Kubernetes, as well as on-premises deployments. Console, I think, is now is it the #1 downloaded product in the portfolio?
It always was. Actually, recently just got passed by Terraform, but up until very recently, it's been our most popular product.
So what are your thoughts right now on the Kubernetes ecosystem and your role in it and adoption within the enterprise?
So, I always sort of decompose into the infrastructure market into software layers. I think, to me, there's infrastructure, security, networking, and then there's a runtime platform on top.
Yeah.
I think that's how the market kind of fits together. People generally standardize on their way of infrastructure, security, and networking, but there's just a variety of application types that they're going to run on top of it. And so, to me, Kubernetes is a runtime layer concern. It's sort of, years ago when we did Spring Source, we were focused on commoditizing the app server layer, so the J2E app server market. And I think it's analogous to that. So to me, Kubernetes is a runtime platform, kind of like an app server is a runtime platform. It's not an infrastructure concern or a security concern or a networking concern. It's actually the runtime layer. I think in practice, there's heterogeneity at the runtime layer because you have different application teams building different kinds of applications. So the fundamental thing that's shifted in our view is you're now dropping this application artifact onto a cloud runtime, not onto your on-prem world inside your data center with the clear network perimeter and all the things. And that's the disruptive part of cloud is my application is now being deployed to a low trust network with ephemeral infrastructure, et cetera. So whether it's a Kubernetes application or a Java application or a .NET application, I think that's the question. It has this common way of doing infrastructure underneath. So Kubernetes has certainly got everyone's attention as a modern application platform where things will get deployed. And if you make the argument that, hey, cloud's about net new application deployment, a big percentage of those applications will get deployed in containers and run and scheduled in Kubernetes. But I think, like, to me, the question is Kubernetes the endpoint, is where this market ends, or is it a step along the way? And I think at that runtime layer, if I sort of think about the journey to cloud as one to increasing ephemerality, first I could deploy an app inside an app server inside of a VM on that runtime platform. And then ultimately, maybe that became containers, and that gets deployed to Kubernetes. Well, the next thing is probably serverless. So there'll be some applications that are serverless, and that's not going to be Kubernetes. That's going to be a different kind of a runtime platform. And then actually, maybe the fourth type of application is an edge type application. Like maybe it's going to be deployed on my Comcast box or my Uber car or whatever it is. So I actually think there's not standardization at that layer. And I think Kubernetes is one of the things in our view that is really, really important, but it's one of the things that's really, really important. I think that's a slightly different view than maybe some of the other vendors in the market who say, no, the whole world's going to re-platform onto Kubernetes the same way it did on vSphere. And I just say, to me, it's a runtime layer thing. It's not an infrastructure thing. So therefore, for us, supporting Kubernetes is a critical P0 thing because it's the application platform for many new applications. But it's no less important to us than serverless, and it's no less important to us than edge, and it's no less important to us than being able to have a common networking experience with your VM as well. So I think maybe that's a different view from maybe others in the market who we're fundamentally betting on heterogeneity, not standardization.
And do you see something, to your earlier point, on the journey that you're excited about or you're looking out at for that edge use case? Or others beyond Kubernetes right now?
Yeah, it's funny when you look at the market signals. I think we're all struggling a bit, truthfully, to parse the market signals now that we're all remote because we don't have the same in-person interaction the way we used to, sort of the serendipitous conversations. So I guess what we see, I think you see the cloud providers hyper interested in serverless. Why? Because it's kind of the perfect thing for them. It's highly ephemeral, massive scale. It's the best mapping of cost of compute to application consumption that they can provide. And that's ultimately what they want to do. So I think the cloud providers are keenly interested in serverless. And you see a lot of work from Amazon in particular, who are pushing this agenda hard. So I think that one's interesting to me. I think you think about the problem domain that serverless introduces, it's actually even more profound than what Kubernetes introduces. So like when people start using Kubernetes, what you now have is a highly ephemeral application platform that comes and goes. And so immediately people recognize, oh my goodness, I have a security problem. Like, can this pod talk to this pod? I don't know, what's its identity? So it forces you to adopt something like Vault out of the gate.
Right.
It also introduces a networking problem. Is how do I connect this thing to this thing when they have different IP addresses that come and go all the time? It's actually a really hard problem. So it forces you to adopt something like Console to basically do the networking between. So I think we're super excited by the fact that like Kubernetes introduces a lot of the problems that Terraform, Vault, and Console solve. But serverless does actually, to even more extreme case. It's like, well, this thread spins up. Can it talk to this thing? I don't know. It requires you to use identity-based security and service-based networking because these things move around all the time.
Right.
So I think we're super excited about serverless as a thing because it sort of reinforces the problem domain of cloud and makes Terraform, Vault, and Console even more applicable. But I think what we're now seeing is edge, which is just super surprising to me when you start to see how many of our customers are deploying applications on on the edge. I think there are basically two categories to edge. There's like store endpoints, stores. Like, hey, I'm Walmart. I need to be able to deploy applications to the edge. Well, that's probably running on a 2 CPU machine, like a tiny thing at the edge. But then there's the IoT use case, which is like my light bulb. To me, that's actually equally applicable for what we do as the cloud use case, because when this thing at the edge spins up, it's highly ephemeral, comes and goes. So can it upload its data to this thing over here? I don't know. What's its identity?
Right.
How does it connect to it? I don't know. What's its service name and how do we do service-based networking? So I think actually the big paradigm shift is like infrastructure inside your data center to infrastructure outside your data center. And this is cloud and edge are part of the same market. And I think we're seeing signs, no question, that people are deploying our products at scale on the edge.
Yeah, and I think, all of these layers of abstraction are ultimately, while they're removing some number of problems, abstracting us from them, they're introducing others at the end of the day that we will constantly be challenged with.
I think Kubernetes is the perfect case of that. It's like when I was running an app server, I knew where it was. It was like, it's on that IP address behind that load balancer, and I can deploy an application artifact to it. And great, that's the basis of security. Now that's the basis of networking. You introduce Kubernetes, and now you've got this highly ephemeral thing that's coming and going. It actually breaks everything related to networking and security, and it forces you to actually make this paradigm shift. And
we have a big practice and capability around ServiceNow and IT, SM, and IT operations management. And in that world, it's kind of like, well, how do I operate when everything's coming and going, and how do I do my changes and deployments? And I think this is a problem from back to the people, process, technology conversation that we're helping a lot of clients with, because they just don't know how to change, those legacy procedures and how they operate in that new ephemeral world that you mentioned.
Yeah, I'd say we talk about it as, this is why like DevOps and cloud are kind of two sides of the same coin, and they're so tied together. I think the transition is when you go to cloud, it's actually a different way of delivering applications much more quickly, because you're not having to have someone spin up the infrastructure for you. And now you want to deploy more quickly, and you want to change more quickly because you can. And so it's the shift from ITIL, ticket-based mechanism, which we're all built around, to this sort of more like dynamic DevOps-based thing. And that's sort of what we're alluding to on the skills channel. Like, these things are very well understood. How to hook up my CI/CD pipeline to something that drops my application onto Kubernetes with networking and security solved is a very solved problem, but it's very far from running traditional infrastructure. And I think that's why the market is where it is. It's sort of in this in-between chasm point.
And then you lay on, all the regulations that, highly hospitals and banks and everyone has to live by, insurance companies, and that's when the machine starts to slow down, because they're not, working in concert with one another.
I think, but I would say on that front, though, I think again, that's why we have this kind of obviously they talk about the shift left notion of all this stuff. So many of our customers are highly regulated industries, and they're like, well, you know what? It's great that I can spin up that thing ephemerally, but that doesn't satisfy my auditor, so I can't do that. And I think the journey they go on is to say, well, actually, codification of infrastructure is how you achieve compliance. So the only thing you get to spin up is this pre-approved template. And so it actually is hugely helpful for those regulated industries, because it actually does make it a lot safer if the only thing that gets deployed is a Terraform template that already has the configuration of your F5 load balancer with all things in the right way. There's actually far less risk, but it's a learning curve for the auditors who go, well, that doesn't make sense to me. But in practice, in my view, it's actually far safer than what they're doing before manually.
Yeah, we just worked, it's actually a joint Hashicorp head client where we worked with E&Y, who was the auditor, to kind of walk through the steps of, understanding that every time you deploy, this is what happens, and this is only what happens. And that's an audit trail. That's something that can be stuck in the CMDB if necessary. So it's a very, once you sit down with someone who, is not a technologist, and walk them through the steps of what's happening and can explain it every time, this is what they love it. And I think that's a huge win, but it takes some time, and it doesn't happen overnight.
Well, we've seen it, and I just don't want to pull too far from where you want to go, but the networking market's been fascinating to me, because again, unprompted from us, the networking community has all built Terraform providers for networking gear. So now what I can do is I can actually create a Terraform template and apply it to Cisco ACI, or deploy it to F5, or to Palo Alto Networks. And it's amazing because what you're now doing is you're actually creating the routing rules in code and just it's immutable. It's like Terraform apply to that piece of networking gear now is configured this way. And then when someone deploys something new, you just update the module, Terraform apply again. And it's actually 100% repeatable, which is a kind of the infrastructure as code approach, but for networking. And even though we built Terraform initially for provisioning cloud computing, it's equally applicable to networking. And now most companies that we go to use Terraform as the basis of their network automation. And it is 1,000 times more repeatable than what they were doing before, where someone would open a ticket, someone would click around in a UI, update a routing rule, update it in Excel, and then the next time, hope they do the same thing again.
Yeah. Maybe just before we end, I want to circle back to the open source conversation. And you've been in the industry a long time. You've worked at many companies who've built from the ground up as open source business models. Just what are your thoughts on how the model has changed over time, and what challenges used to exist and may not exist anymore, and what new challenges are you faced with living in an open source world today?
So yeah, the world's changed a ton, and I actually think GitHub is the reason. So if you kind of go back maybe a decade, the only way to get lots of people to work with you on a project was by contributing it to a software foundation. So if I had this idea that, say, perhaps I wanted to build a lightweight app server because I didn't like the idea that we're paying a huge tax to BA and an IBM, I would create something like Tomcat. I would contribute it to the Apache Software Foundation, and I would say, hey, everybody, let's all of us work together to build a lightweight app server. And so then it's in the governance of the Apache Software Foundation. I'll get like 5 different vendors to come and work with me. And that's been the model of the past. Like the power of that model is I could aggregate a lot of people to work with me. The kind of the weakness of that model is now anybody that had commit rights to Apache Tomcat can actually sell it. Because then logically the vendor ecosystem goes, hey, I'm IBM, I'll sell you Tomcat. Why? Because I employ a committer to Tomcat, and if there's a bug, I can fix it, so I can credibly sell it. And you saw that as the older model, where you had big groups of basically foundation-based people building software. And I think the downside, number one, is obviously the fact that it becomes really difficult to commercialize because so many vendors can sell it, price goes to zero. It's really hard to build a sustainable enterprise that way. Number two, the foundation model just is like it's a bit like a government. We saw that with OpenStack and others, where everybody has an opinion. Now I got 5 vendors and they want to pull it in a direction that they want. So you end up with something that is like not quite as tight as it would have otherwise been because of those dynamics. So it was hard to build businesses that were sustainable in that model for both the financial reason that it was hard to monetize them, and number two, because the tech sort of splintered in a way you didn't like. Along comes GitHub and says, wait a second, all the developers in the world are on GitHub, so let's collaborate on GitHub. And so now I can create an open source project on GitHub, and I can get 1,000 people to collaborate with me. I can put an open source license on it so anybody can fork it, and it's comfortable for everybody. But I can actually have much tighter control over the design of that project. So it's just driven by a small group of people that really care about architectural purity and how this is going to go in the long term. And I think that's the model that we run today. And so what we do with our products is we put them on GitHub. They're on the Mozilla license. We have 1,000 contributors to it, but we should be clear, like something like Terraform has a very small number of committers to the core, and they all work for Hashicorp. And we are very deliberate about designing software that we control. And it gives us this touch point to the market that both lets us build a world-class product, but also lets us be a long-term vendor partner to the market, because it's in a sense vendor driven. IBM can't sell it to you and force me to compete. I think that's a little bit what we're seeing in the Kubernetes ecosystem. Kubernetes is sort of built in the older model in the Linux and the CNCF. And now I think there are 60 distributions of Kubernetes. So everybody's out there clubbing each other to death saying, no, you buy my Kubernetes, buy my Kubernetes. And ultimately, the only people that win are the big vendors with the most salespeople. I think that's what's happened. So now you've got VMware and Red Hat, by and large, sort of clubbing each other to death, saying, no, my Kubernetes is better than their Kubernetes. It's the same product. And I think that's how the open source model is different. I think there's a much more tight vendor point of view around software, because GitHub allows us to do that without contributing to a foundation.
Great. Well, I appreciate you taking the time today. Very exciting stuff that you guys are working on, and foundational to, I think, this digital transformation. So talk again soon, and thank you for being here today.
No, thank you. And we really appreciate the partnership. There are a lot of companies who we're working with together, so I appreciate it.
Thanks, Dave.
Thanks for listening to Looking Ahead, featuring Eric Kaplan. Looking Ahead is produced by Ahead, experts in delivering enterprise cloud infrastructure, intelligent operations, and modern applications. We build platforms for digital business. Learn more at thinkahead.com.